one of the things that we've been seeing from some of our allies of late are pledges to spend more on their armed forces because of what we've seen happen in Ukraine. Not all of them. The United States already spending an awful lot on the armed forces. I don't know if the British want to spend a ton much on their armed forces, but the Germans who have kind of spent the entire post-Cold War period in a not entirely pacifist, that wouldn't be fair to say, but not wildly off from that, have said they're going to spend big on their armed forces. The other big standout among the large, wealthy NATO countries, which, as much as this shocks Canadians, we are one of them, we're the standout. Canada and Germany were among the laggards of NATO, and we're also a big one here. I had an interesting conversation with just a buddy, a guy who knows public policy pretty well in terms of the nuts and bolts of how government operates. He knows it a lot better than I do. And we were talking about the idea of the new the NATO target, 2% of GDP spent on defense a year. For Canada, that would be like spending about $40 billion a year. Right now, we spend in the mid-20s, and it's been tracking up towards 30 because the federal government had already pledged to spend more on defense, but kind of in a keeping up with inflation way. So where are we going to find the bucks, if we choose to actually spend more on the military? Now, there's a couple of things you got to know here. I'm not betting the proverbial farm that we do. I actually think we might. And I know this, I may be in the future watching this video going, wow, I was naive. I was an idiot. Of course we didn't spend the money on the military. I'm not saying it's a certainty. I'm saying we might. If we do, what will we spend it on? Now, moving to the 2% NATO target is going to mean spending probably an extra $10 to $15 billion on defense a year, every year, at least for the foreseeable future. And what he and I got to talking about was just kind of blue skying this. Is that going to be hard to sustain? Will we be able to find worthy things to spend it on? It's an interesting question. And I know you might be thinking, well, of course we can spend the money. Spending the money isn't the problem. Spending the money well is more the problem. It won't be hard in the first couple of years. You could pretty easily come up with a list of things we could spend money on in the military, like big tens of billions of dollars sums immediately, and all it would do was flesh out capabilities we claim we have, but we really don't. Things that we say we can do or capabilities we want to have and that we have some of, but, the equipment's in bad shape or the units are under strength or we haven't properly modernized it. Like, you could take tens of billions of bucks. So let's call that 2 or 3 years of spending at the 2% target and just basically take the military we actually have and flesh it out. Actually put some meat on the bones of our really starved Canadian Armed Forces. What about after that, though? What about after we've fixed all the bases, we've upgraded all the ships, we've brought all our equipment into a state of good repair, we've hopefully tried to address some of the recruitment gaps? What is next? I don't know. That's a political decision. That's a policy decision. Canada is going to have to decide what kind of armed forces it wants. Even if we assume we're going to increase the spending, that we are going to move in lockstep with some of our allies here and go, you know what, history didn't end after all, and we actually do need a more robust armed forces. What kind of armed forces? What capabilities do we want? What are we willing to not do? What will we count on from our allies, getting from them? Like, what are capabilities that we don't need to duplicate because someone we trust already has them? Are we worried about the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Arctic, air, space, land? How much of a commitment do we want to be able to sustain in each of those domains? How much do we want to look at surveillance or special forces versus maybe buying more tanks and creating an armored brigade? Like, these are all things we can do. But after those first couple of years, when we have just basically spent $30-40 billion at least just modernizing the military we already have and actually adding some capability back that really only exists on paper now, and maybe we've made some of the equipment purchases we've long been delaying, after maybe 3, maybe 4 years, sustaining that higher commitment is going to mean actually having a defense policy, actually having a conversation as Canadians through our political processes about what we think this country ought to be able to do. I think that will be the harder part. If you're Prime Minister Trudeau, if you're the Liberals, if you're any of the people likely to replace Mr. Trudeau from any party in an upcoming election, you can probably be sold during this emergency, not guaranteed, but probably be sold on the need to flesh out the military on an urgent basis. But actually deciding what kind of force we're going to have going into the future on a long-term sense, that is the kind of mature national dialogue on matters of national security that this country is not known for having. Let's face it. If we were known for having those kinds of discussions, we probably wouldn't be in the mess we're in anyway.